Justice. Trust. These are the pillars upon which society stands, the unshakable foundations that bind us together. We turn to those in authority for guidance, expecting fairness, expecting truth. These individuals, the judges, the lawmakers, the enforcers, are the guardians of order, tasked with ensuring that justice is served, that the scales remain balanced. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when the very individual sworn to uphold justice harbors a secret so devastating, so unfathomable, that it leads to an unimaginable crime? This isn't just a scandal. This isn't just another sensational headline. This is a story of betrayal, deception, and the tragic unraveling of a life once revered. A story where power and secrecy collided with consequences so irreversible that no courtroom verdict could make sense of it all. She was admired, respected, a figure whose presence commanded authority in courtrooms where truth and lies waged war daily. For years, she sat behind the judge's bench, listening, deliberating, deciding the fate of others. With each ruling, she carried the weight of responsibility, the expectation to uphold the law, the duty to remain impartial. But no one could have imagined that behind her own closed doors, within the confines of her private life, she was entangled in a secret so profound that when it came to light, it destroyed everything, not just her reputation, not just her career, but an entire family. In Ontario, one judge had built a legacy beyond the walls of the courtroom. A figure praised for her intellect, for her ability to dispense justice with precision. She was seen as a voice of reason, a figure of wisdom, an embodiment of everything the judicial system was meant to represent. But beneath that image, beneath the surface of her professional success, a different reality was unfolding. One she fought desperately to keep hidden. One that, if exposed, would shatter the carefully constructed identity she had cultivated over the years. Something darker was lurking beneath that life of prestige, something more personal, more dangerous. Secrets have a way of unraveling when they are least expected. No matter how tightly they are woven into daily existence, no matter how desperately one clings to control, eventually, the truth finds its way out. And when the truth began clawing its way to the surface in this story, the consequences were catastrophic. The revelations were more than just shocking, they were horrifying. Unbelievable. A truth so devastating that when the weight of deception became unbearable, an irreversible decision was made. A decision that would leave an entire family in ruins. It started quietly. A secret known only to two people. A secret never meant to escape the private world in which it was contained. But the walls of secrecy are fragile, and the moment cracks began to form, the inevitable followed. This wasn't a story about an impulsive crime. This wasn't an act committed in the heat of anger. This was something far more calculated, something planned. A reaction to the realization that exposure was inevitable, that the life she had built was on the verge of collapsing under the truth she could no longer control. The case shook Ontario. At first, the details seemed almost impossible to comprehend. How could someone entrusted with enforcing the law commit an act that defied every principle of justice? How could a woman so revered, so respected, willingly dismantle her own world in such a horrific way? How did it come to this? The unraveling began with a revelation. A truth so unbearable that there was no way to contain it any longer. A hidden pregnancy, an affair buried under layers of secrecy, a desperate attempt to silence the consequences of her choices. But secrets do not die quietly. And in this case, when the truth surfaced, the fallout was unlike anything anyone could have predicted. We will uncover the tragic downfall of a woman who held the law in her hands, who, for years, had dictated verdicts, delivered judgments, ensured that justice was upheld. But when her own truth was exposed, no court of justice could protect her. No carefully crafted defense could erase what had happened. No amount of legal expertise could conceal the devastation left in the wake of her actions. This is the story of the Ontario judge whose private deception led to an unimaginable crime. The questions that followed were endless. What happened inside that home? What led a woman of such stature, such power, to commit a crime so horrifying? What drove her to make the decisions that would ultimately destroy everything she had worked for? What secrets did she attempt to bury, and why did it all end in bloodshed? This is more than just a scandal. More than just another headline in the news cycle. This is a tragedy, one built on lies, betrayal, and irreversible choices. One that left questions no verdict could fully answer. One that forced an entire community to reckon with a reality they had never seen coming. But behind every crime, behind every act of destruction, there is a story. A sequence of events leading to that final moment, the point of no return. And that is where we begin. Not at the end, not at the crime scene, but at the first fracture in the foundation. The moment when the secrets first began to unravel. The moment that set everything in motion. And as we uncover the details, as we piece together the timeline, we must ask ourselves, was this crime inevitable? Could it have been prevented? Or was it destined to happen from the moment the first deception took root? This is a story you won't forget. Before the tragedy, Judge Florence was known as a respected figure in the Ontario court system. She was a woman of authority, well-versed in the law, admired for her sharp mind and meticulous approach to justice. Within the walls of the courthouse, her presence commanded attention, a judge whose rulings carried weight, whose decisions shaped the futures of those who stood before her. She was thorough, measured, unwavering in her application of the law. Lawyers who argued cases in her courtroom understood the gravity of her decisions, and her peers saw her as someone destined for higher judicial offices. Over the years, Judge Florence built a reputation that few could contest. Her legal career was pristine, unmarred by scandal, her professional conduct impeccable. She was sought after for her insights, trusted to handle complex cases with precision. Her understanding of the law was unparalleled, her ability to dissect the most intricate details of a case respected even by those who opposed her rulings. But there was another side to Florence, a side that wasn't visible to the world that admired her, a side that lived not in the courtroom, but behind the closed doors of her personal life. And it was within those closed doors that the first cracks in the perfect image began to form. For years, Judge Florence had cultivated an existence that appeared flawless, an existence rooted in discipline, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of success. But beneath the surface of that controlled life, there were secrets. Secrets known only to a handful of people. And one of them was her 17-year-old nephew. He was young, full of promise, navigating the complexities of adolescence while quietly living in the shadow of his aunt's legacy. Unlike her, his life was still unfolding, still filled with uncertainty about the future. He had dreams of his own, ambitions that stretched far beyond the small world he knew. But despite his youth, despite the innocence that should have defined his years, he found himself entangled in a situation that would defy reason, that would unravel into a catastrophe neither he nor anyone around him could have predicted. The relationship between the judge and her nephew was on the surface ordinary. She was a guardian figure, someone who had guided him through various phases of his life, someone who had shaped his understanding of right and wrong. But beneath the normalcy, beneath the familiarity of their interactions, there existed something else, something far more complicated. And as time passed, that complication grew into a secret that could no longer be contained. Their interactions weren't scrutinized, their connection wasn't questioned. To the outside world, nothing about their relationship appeared unusual. She had always been protective, had always ensured that her nephew had everything he needed, had always acted as a figure of guidance. But as their bond deepened, as the lines blurred between what was appropriate and what was not, there came a point when the truth could no longer remain hidden. What happened behind closed doors in the months leading up to the tragedy is something only they would ever fully understand. The signs, if they existed, were subtle, too discreet for anyone to recognize before it was too late. Was it calculated? Was it reckless? Was it inevitable? These are the questions that would haunt the aftermath of what transpired. What is certain is that when the reality of their relationship emerged, it carried consequences that neither of them could escape. The setting of this story, the place where these events unfolded, was far removed from the tension of a courtroom. It wasn't a legal battleground where verdicts were issued and fates were determined. It was the judge's private world, her home, a place meant to be a refuge, a place meant to be untouched by the scrutiny of her professional life, a place meant to remain undisturbed by the chaos of public attention. But that sanctuary, that space where she had hidden her truth, would soon become the center of an unfolding tragedy. The neighborhood itself was unremarkable, suburban, quiet, the kind of place where people rarely questioned the affairs of those around them. The homes lined the streets in perfect symmetry, driveways occupied by cars that had sat there undisturbed for years, gardens carefully tended, the rhythm of daily life steady and predictable. Nothing about it hinted at the darkness that was about to take shape within the walls of one of those houses. Nothing about it indicated that within a well-kept home, beneath the exterior of success and stability, a storm had been brewing, a storm that, once unleashed, would dismantle everything in its path. Judge Florence had spent years controlling the narrative of her life. She had dictated the stories told within her courtroom, shaped the realities of those who stood before her. But the one story she could never control was her own. And as the details of her secret began to emerge, as the circumstances surrounding her personal life became impossible to conceal, she found herself facing an inevitability she could no longer escape. The truth had surfaced. The walls had begun to close in. And as she stood within the confines of her home, surrounded by a world she had built upon carefully measured choices, one question remained: how far would she go to keep the life she had created from crumbling beneath the weight of her own decisions? This is where the story begins. The unraveling. The moment when control slipped from her grasp. The moment when fear, desperation, and the consequences of secrecy collided in a way that would change everything. Forever. The crime. What went wrong? Secrets, when buried deep enough, begin to feel like they no longer exist. They become whispers in the mind, fragments of hidden reality locked away from the world. But secrets do not vanish. They do not dissolve into nothingness. They wait. And when the time comes, when the weight of deception becomes too heavy to bear, they force their way into the open, without mercy, without pause, without concern for the destruction they may leave behind. For months, Judge Florence had kept her secret locked away, wrapped in layers of control and denial. She had perfected the art of compartmentalization, separating the life she lived in the courtroom from the life she hid behind closed doors. The deception was deliberate, calculated, a protective shield built not just for herself, but for those entangled in her truth. But that shield, that carefully woven illusion, was never indestructible. And when the cracks formed, when the first signs of exposure emerged, everything unraveled. Rapidly, irrevocably. The moment that shattered her secrecy did not come suddenly. It had been building for weeks, creeping toward inevitability like a slow-moving storm. The signs were there, subtle at first, then undeniable. The physical changes, the unspoken shifts in behavior, the lingering tension in conversations that once felt normal. People began to notice, colleagues, acquaintances, even members of her own family. The questions started as whispers, quiet uncertainties spoken behind closed doors. And then, finally, the confrontation that would change everything. It was a conversation she had been avoiding, a question she had hoped would never be asked, a moment she knew would force her into a reality she had been desperately trying to suppress. When the words were spoken, when the truth of her pregnancy was no longer a concealed thought, but a confirmed fact, there was no turning back. No denial. No escape. It was out in the open now, standing before her like a mirror she could no longer look away from. The response was immediate. Shock. Confusion. Anger. How could this have happened? How had she allowed it to happen? The confrontation was tense, voices rising, emotions clashing against the cold walls of the home that had once been her sanctuary. And with every passing second, the consequences of her deception became clearer. This was no longer a secret she could control. This was no longer something she could manipulate or hide behind technicalities. This was reality. And reality had consequences. She had built her life on control, on the ability to dictate outcomes. But in that moment, as the truth stood unchallenged before her, she had no control. She had no influence over what would come next. No authority to reverse what had already begun. And it was in that loss of control, in that realization that the world she had created was crumbling. That fear took hold. A fear unlike any she had ever experienced. What would happen now? How would the truth shape the future she had worked so tirelessly to build? What would people say? What would they think? The questions flooded her mind, racing faster than she could process them. There was no logical path forward, no careful maneuvering that could undo the damage. And in that moment of desperation, of complete and utter panic, the decision was made. A decision born not of rational thought, but of raw, unfiltered fear. A decision that would lead to an irreversible tragedy. The details of what happened next would be dissected endlessly by investigators, debated by legal analysts, studied by forensic experts. The sequence of events, how the crime unfolded, the precise moment when the decision turned to action, would be mapped out, reconstructed, analyzed for every possible clue. But what mattered most was the why, the motive. The psychological breaking point that transformed fear into something far more devastating. The events of that night were swift, chaotic, impossible to undo. There was no hesitation, no pause for reconsideration. It was over before it had even begun, before anyone had the chance to intervene, before the weight of reality could fully set in. And when it was done, when the silence took hold once more, the consequences stood like ghosts in the aftermath. The lives lost, the irreversible damage, the home that had once been untouched by scandal, now the center of a crime that defied explanation. In the hours that followed, the house remained eerily still, as though it, too, had absorbed the shock of what had transpired. The air hung heavy, suffocating in its silence. And somewhere, beneath the cold weight of that silence, Judge Florence stood, alone, facing the remnants of a decision that could never be undone. And as the hours stretched into morning, as the world beyond those walls continued unaware, the inevitable came knocking. The discovery, the unraveling. The moment when the story became more than just a secret held within one household, but a headline, a tragedy, a crime that would shake an entire community. But this was not the end. Not yet. Because with discovery came investigation. And with investigation came the search for answers. Answers that, even in their most thorough form, would never fully explain why. Why it had come to this. Why control had turned to destruction. Why, in the face of exposure, the only choice had been irreversible. And as Ontario awoke to the news, as the story began to spread beyond the quiet neighborhood where it had taken place, one question remained unanswered. How could someone entrusted with enforcing the law, with ensuring justice, commit an act that defied every principle she had spent her life defending? It was a question that would linger, a question that would define the next chapter of this story, the investigation, the trial, the aftermath. Because justice had been her domain. Justice had been her purpose. But in the end, justice could not save her. Justice could not undo what had already been done. And as the courtroom doors opened, not for her to judge, but for her to stand accused, the final phase of the story began. The search for answers. The attempt to make sense of the senseless. The reckoning of a truth that had refused to stay buried. The investigation, the hunt for the truth. Silence. A silence so unnatural, so heavy, that it swallowed the house whole. Hours had passed, though the weight of time felt immeasurable. The walls, once familiar, had become witnesses to something irreversible, something inescapable. And beyond those walls, the world continued unaware, until it didn't. When authorities received the call, there was little indication of the horror waiting for them inside the judge's home. At first, it was a routine welfare check, concerns raised by a friend who hadn't heard from Florence, unanswered calls accumulating without response. But as officers approached the property, as they stepped toward the pristine front door of the house that had long concealed its secrets, there was an unshakable sense that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. The first knock went unanswered. The second met with nothing but the eerie stillness of an undisturbed home. It wasn't until they tried the handle, until the door slowly creaked open, that the urgency shifted. What awaited them inside was not the quiet of a sleeping house, not the innocence of an untouched crime scene, but devastation, a tableau of violence frozen in time. The first officer stepped forward, radio gripped in his hand, body tense, eyes scanning. And then they saw it. The markings of struggle, the smudges of blood leading deeper into the house, the faint metallic scent filling the air. They moved quickly, their training pushing them forward even as their minds screamed that they already knew, they already understood, that this was not an ordinary case. This was something far, far worse. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived. Detectives, forensic analysts, teams tasked with deciphering the scene that lay before them. The rooms were searched, every corner examined, every possible clue documented. The bodies were found in separate parts of the house, scattered, but connected by the same terrible fate. There was no immediate explanation, no sign of forced entry, no evidence of outside involvement. And yet, the horror was undeniable. The first priority was clear: finding Florence. Finding the woman whose home had become the scene of an unspeakable crime. But she was nowhere to be found. The master bedroom, empty. The kitchen, undisturbed. The silence remained unbroken. Until, finally, she was discovered sitting alone, motionless, her expression unreadable. No resistance. No attempt to flee. Just an eerie stillness, as if she had already accepted the inevitable. Where's Stanley? It was the first question spoken aloud, the first attempt to make sense of the tragedy. But Florence didn't answer. Not immediately. And when she did, her words were chilling. He's gone. Simple. Final. No emotion. No explanation. Just those two words, marking the end of a life that should have never been taken. The arrest was swift, textbook in execution. Handcuffs secured. Florence led from the home that had once been her sanctuary, but now served only as evidence of everything that had gone wrong. Officers maintained their professionalism, but even as they followed protocol, there was an unshakable weight pressing down on them. Because this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another suspect in custody. This was a judge, a figure of authority, of law, of justice, now accused of a crime that defied reason. And yet, the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic team worked meticulously, piecing together a timeline that would later become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Blood spatter patterns indicated precise movements, deliberate choices. The wounds, calculated rather than chaotic, suggesting intention rather than impulse. And then, the discovery that transformed speculation into certainty. Florence's fingerprints, not just scattered throughout the scene, but placed where they should never have been. On the weapon. On Stanley's belongings. On the remnants of the life she had just erased. The motive? At first, it seemed incomprehensible. How could someone like Florence, someone so disciplined, so revered, make such a decision? What had driven her to cross the ultimate line? The investigation deepened, detectives working tirelessly to uncover every detail, every hidden factor that had led to this moment. And slowly, the truth emerged. It had been fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing everything. When the pregnancy was discovered, when Stanley became the unintentional threat to the life Florence had built, her reality shifted. What had once been a secret she could control became a danger she could not silence. And in that panic, in that desperate search for a way out, she had chosen the unthinkable. The news spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the community, through the legal system that had once trusted Florence without question. Headlines dissected every possible angle, reporters grasping at fragments of information, trying to make sense of a crime that refused to fit any logical framework. How could this have happened? How had no one seen the signs? And, most of all, what would happen next? Florence wasn't just another suspect being processed through the system. She was someone who had once presided over it, someone who had spent years determining the fate of others. And now, she sat in the very position she had once condemned others to. The prosecution built their case carefully, methodically, knowing that convicting someone of Florence's stature wouldn't be easy. But in the end, the facts spoke for themselves. The evidence was undeniable. And Florence, once a judge, now a defendant, would have to face the very justice she had spent her life defending. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. Because the question remained, could justice truly be served when the one accused was someone who had spent their career upholding it? As the trial approached, as the world waited for answers, one undeniable truth remained: Florence had made her choice. And now, she would have to live with its consequences. Psychological and legal analysis. What drives a person, especially one of high status, to commit an act that defies the very values they have spent their life defending? It is a question that has perplexed criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars for centuries. Because when crimes are committed by those whom society has entrusted with power, with authority, with responsibility, the shock is magnified. And in the case of Judge Florence, the reality of that shock was unavoidable. Florence was not just another defendant standing trial for a heinous act. She was a judge, a woman who had spent years analyzing criminal intent, dissecting motives, delivering verdicts that determined the futures of countless individuals. She understood the law better than most. She had seen the devastating consequences of crime firsthand. And yet, when faced with her own secrets unraveling, when the weight of exposure threatened to dismantle everything she had built, she made a choice. A choice that contradicted every ruling she had ever delivered. A choice that sealed her fate. Criminal psychologists have long debated the tipping point, the moment where rational decision-making collapses under pressure, leading an individual toward irreversible actions. In Florence's case, that moment came when secrecy was no longer an option. The hidden pregnancy, the affair with her nephew Stanley, the questions that had begun to arise, every element threatened to expose the truth she had so carefully concealed. For a woman of power, the fear of losing control was greater than the fear of the law itself. And that, experts argue, was precisely why she acted. But was it impulse? Or was it something deeper? Something more calculated? The forensic analysis painted a chilling picture, one that indicated precision, intentionality, a crime committed not in the heat of an emotional breakdown but in a desperate attempt to erase a truth she could not escape. The wounds on the victims were consistent, deliberate, suggesting a mind that had already accepted the inevitability of what was to come. No hesitation, no pause, just action. And that, prosecutors argued, was the defining factor in the trial that followed. Psychological breakdown, the mind of Florence. Florence's mental state became the center of discussion. Was she experiencing psychosis? Had paranoia consumed her rationality? Or was this crime simply a manifestation of a lifetime of control collapsing in one catastrophic moment? Forensic psychologists examined her behavior in the months leading up to the crime. Close associates noted changes in her demeanor, an increasing need for isolation, an avoidance of personal discussions, a fixation on perfection in her professional life even as her personal life unraveled. But were these signs of a troubled mind? Or were they simply indicators of a woman desperately trying to maintain an illusion? What experts agree on is that Florence exhibited symptoms of extreme narcissistic control, an inability to accept failure, an unwillingness to allow circumstances beyond her grasp to dictate the direction of her life. And when that control slipped, her response was not to submit to the truth, but to erase it. However, narcissism alone does not explain murder. There had to be more, and the court aimed to find it. The legal consequences, trial and verdict. When Florence entered the courtroom, not as the judge, but as the accused, the weight of irony was unbearable. She had spent years behind the bench, delivering sentences, determining guilt, wielding the power of the judicial system. Now, she stood in the defendant's chair, listening as others dissected her actions, as the very system she once controlled sought to determine her fate. The prosecution built its case meticulously. The forensic evidence, the timeline of events, the inconsistencies in Florence's initial statements, all presented with careful precision. The defense argued mental instability, psychological distress, an emotional collapse that led to irrational actions. But the jury listened to something else. They listened to Florence herself, her demeanor, her refusal to acknowledge the severity of what had transpired. And when the verdict was delivered, it was clear Florence's actions were not viewed as accidental, nor as symptoms of temporary psychosis. They were intentional, calculated, and, in the eyes of the court, unforgivable. The sentence came swiftly. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. A decision as firm and unwavering as the sentences Florence herself had delivered throughout her career. Justice, in its purest form, had arrived. And this time, Florence was the one condemned by it. Ethical discussions, power, secrecy, and judicial responsibility. The trial was over, but the questions remained. How does someone entrusted with justice betray it so profoundly? How does a person tasked with upholding morality justify the act of murder? And how does a society reconcile the reality that even those who wield power are capable of committing unthinkable crimes? Legal scholars dissected the ethical ramifications of the case. How many safeguards had failed? How many warning signs had been ignored? Was Florence's downfall inevitable, or could it have been prevented before tragedy struck? For years, Florence had carried an untouchable status, respected, trusted, believed to be above reproach. But no one is beyond consequence. And in the end, the very laws she enforced became the forces that determined her own fate. The debate extended beyond the courtroom, into universities, into legal circles, into discussions of judicial ethics. Should those in positions of power be held to higher standards? Should safeguards exist to prevent individuals like Florence from falling into corruption before it is too late? Or is the reality simply that power does not change people? It only reveals them. In the end, one truth became undeniable. Florence had spent her life commanding the law. But the law does not serve individuals. It serves justice. And justice, in this case, arrived without mercy. Conclusion. What we can learn. Some crimes fade into history, passing quietly into court records and archived news reports. Others linger. They leave behind echoes of unanswered questions, fragments of lessons society cannot afford to ignore. The case of Judge Florence is not one that fades. It is one that demands reflection, one that forces us to confront the unsettling truth that power, authority, and status do not absolve anyone of consequence. And, perhaps most importantly, that no secret remains buried forever. What happened within the walls of Florence's home was more than just a crime. It was the unraveling of a life that had been built upon deception. It was the slow collapse of a woman who had spent years maintaining control, wielding influence, dictating outcomes, until the one truth she feared the most surfaced in a way she could not contain. That truth, that final exposure, led to irreversible tragedy. And now, as Florence sits within the walls of a prison instead of a courtroom, as she faces the weight of her own sentence instead of issuing verdicts upon others, she is no longer the untouchable figure of justice she once was. She is simply another name in the long and tragic history of those who believed they could outrun the truth. But this case is not just about Florence. It is about the broader implications of secrecy, of unchecked power, of the decisions made in moments of desperation that can alter lives forever. It is about the ethical responsibility of those in positions of influence, and the systems that must exist to prevent individuals like Florence from descending into corruption before disaster strikes. Because this crime did not happen in isolation. It was preceded by warning signs, subtle at first, then glaring yet ignored. And in that negligence, tragedy was allowed to take shape. So where does justice go from here? What lessons remain for those who watch this story unfold, for the legal system that once trusted Florence, for the society that believed in the structure she was sworn to uphold? One lesson is clear: power does not shield anyone from the weight of their choices. No title, no status, no reputation can erase the consequences of wrongdoing. And in the end, when deception transforms into destruction, the truth will always surface. Whether in the quiet revelations of guilt or in the devastating aftermath of violence, it will emerge. It will demand recognition. And, ultimately, it will dictate justice. But justice is not just about punishment. It is about understanding. It is about confronting the reality that no one is above accountability, that no institution is immune to failure, that no individual, regardless of their stature, can escape the reckoning of their own actions. And it is about ensuring that cases like Florence's serve as more than just headlines. Because stories like this must be more than cautionary tales. They must be catalysts for change. For those who enforce the law, the lesson is even clearer. Power is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. It is a duty that requires vigilance, ethical integrity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And when power is wielded recklessly, when it is used to conceal rather than to protect, the consequences are devastating. Florence was not the first judge to fall into scandal, and she will not be the last. But how many more tragedies must unfold before accountability is placed at the forefront? Before warning signs are taken seriously? Before systems are strengthened to ensure justice does not become merely an illusion? And for society, for those watching, for those reading this story and asking how something like this could happen, the answer is unsettling but necessary to acknowledge. It happened because deception thrives where oversight is absent. Because people believe they can control narratives indefinitely. And because, in the absence of intervention, desperation leads to choices that cannot be undone. So what can we learn? Perhaps the most important lesson is one we often forget: truth, in its purest form, is relentless. It does not ask for permission to be revealed. It does not wait for the right moment. It arrives when it must, often in the most unforgiving ways. And when it does not care for titles, reputations, or carefully constructed images. It cares only for reality. And reality, when confronted, demands justice. Judge Florence's story is one that will continue to be analyzed, debated, studied by legal scholars, psychologists, and criminologists searching for deeper answers. But for those of us watching, for those of us trying to make sense of it all, there is only one undeniable truth: justice is not just a system. It is a force. It is a presence that exists beyond courtrooms, beyond verdicts, beyond sentencing. It is the weight of accountability that, sooner or later, comes for everyone who believes they can escape it. Tonight, we close the chapter on Judge Florence. But the questions remain. What do you think should have been done differently? Could this crime have been prevented? Could the signs have been caught sooner? Could justice have arrived before tragedy struck? Tell us what you think. Share your thoughts. Because in cases like this, justice is not just in the hands of the legal system, it is in the hands of those who remember, those who demand answers, those who refuse to let stories like this fade into silence. Thank you for watching.